Hello and welcome. You're watching QTV and you are watching The Week in Review. I'm your host Ade Darami, and here is my co-host and friend Modern Boj. Mr. Boj, as ever, welcome to the program.
Absolutely, as ever, thank you.
Thank you. Now, I always do this because who knows, there might be people watching the show for the first time. So what we have is, we have an hour or so and we go through 10 big stories that we've chosen from the week just gone by. So hang on and you'll get the idea. First one, there'd been rumors, counter rumors, and of course these days, thanks to the internet and social media, lots and lots of rumors. What were they making rumors about? Who was the president going to pick for his new cabinet? Anyway, suspense is over, now we know. Have a look.
President Adama Barrow has today announced a reshuffled cabinet which, among other appointments, sees the appointment of a new vice president and the splitting of the information ministry into two separate ministries. In the new cabinet, Ali Badara Diouf, formerly the higher education minister, becomes the new vice president. Sidi Keita, previously the trade minister, replaces Mambouri Njie as finance minister. Musa Drame, the erstwhile minister of lands, moves to the fisheries ministry, replacing James Games. At the Ministry of Defense, Serigne Modou Njie replaces Sheikh Omar Faye.
There you heard just a few of the appointments. We didn't go through all. I think 11 kept their posts, Mr. Mboj. So it wasn't a kind of a night of the long knives. But nonetheless, what were your thoughts when you heard the new cabinet after the reshuffle?
Yeah, so it was about half and half,
Yeah.
roughly, as it were. I'm gone. Interesting. But first, I think he wrong-footed the grapevine, didn't he? Because a lot of speculation, rumor, gossip, and all the rest of it, these things were swirling around, even to the extent of I heard one saying that the vice president was going to be a woman.
That's right.
And a Christian at that.
I'd heard that as well.
Absolutely. So this time he showed us that he could be a master in remixing things.
Right.
Then what do we have here?
Yes.
A new vice president.
A new vice president.
Ali Badara Diouf.
Yes,
formerly of higher education. Absolutely. Afterwards, what I did was I went out sort of sounding out others.
Right.
People who sort of follow these things.
In reaction to it.
With that appointment, a lot of people seem gratified by it. They felt that with the experience, it's been around for a long time. He's done all sorts of things, a teacher, and UNESCO.
Right.
I mean, I think he's done quite a bit of experience. So with that, there as vice president, that will help.
Sure.
Because for a while people have been complaining about perhaps the lack of depth as it were around the president, that sort of thing.
Sure.
So this will help. Very interesting there. And then we move on to the others.
Yes. And I was going to say, I mean, you know at least one of the new ministers, a former governor, so yes.
Oh, absolutely. Let me take, yes, that's the new Minister of Natural Resources,
sure,
I think Environment, Climate Change and Natural Resources, John Manjang. She was my colleague at Quantum Net Institute of Technology. So, very plucky woman, dynamic.
I heard she had a particular nickname.
I gave her Margaret Thatcher. Sort of. But this is it. So I said, that's fine. And you even have people like Abdullah Diop.
Because I was going to say, what about the others? Yes.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Abdullah Diop was MD at NAWEC,
that's right.
Managing Director. And before the Living Jammeh's period, I think he was the Minister, I think Trade.
Right.
At some point he served something like that. And afterwards, towards the end, he was at the OMBG.
That's right.
Headquarters in Dakar, which we are all excited about. What is about to be rolled out here, what it would make to the energy sector. So a lot of people felt that was also a brilliant appointment, that sort of thing. So now, for us afterwards, the discussion moved on to, what about those that he had retained?
Yes.
How might we assess their performance?
This is it, because you would imagine they were retained because their performance was good. That's the assumption. That's almost the natural assumption one makes. So, having said that, let's mark some of the report cards, shall we? In tourism, Amat NK Ba, of course, very much a staunch ally of the president, and Minister of Tourism, tourism has taken quite a hit because of COVID, and so that has kind of muddied the waters in terms of assessing any Minister of Tourism's performance, not just here, all over the world. Sierra Leone, Cape Verde, that I'm aware of, they've really struggled. So his was perhaps not a surprise. Also the Minister of Health, again, COVID really had to kind of bring out the best in those people, at the Ministry of Health and also Ministry of Tourism. But what are your own views about some of these folks?
Absolutely. In Hamad's case, with tourism, of course, there's can I call it an alibi? COVID-19, as it were, granted, given that obviously we were at the mercy of the travel restrictions and that sort of thing. That was huge, and there was nothing that he could do about it. But again, when I look at sort of what I might regard as his policy directions, he says that he wants to encourage, what do you call it? Internal tourism.
Yes,
and then government investing in all these different sites where tourism could be developed and the like. And we all felt that, no, government shouldn't do that. We were not sure about that policy decision. With these things we've seen around the world, try to encourage the private sector to take up much of that sort of spending and investing, you know what I mean? So there might be areas in which you may need to invest, but you are more of the body setting out the policy, directing it, as it were, having a direction and monitoring, managing it towards there, would bring more of private sector. We think that would be better. The money should be spent elsewhere, in education, health, and the like. But again, the presidential election.
Yes.
And the National Assembly, the support.
His brought his,
also, he brought
his members to.
Absolutely. So we must also take into account that sort of political pressure.
It's inevitable.
It is inevitable. Sure. So he remained, perhaps with the Minister of Basic Education. No surprise there.
Yeah, quite.
that sort of thing.
Still there. Yeah.
That's it. But then you move to lands.
Yes, sure. Yeah, there's been a change.
It's our drama.
Yeah.
Move to what? Fisheries.
That's right.
Brought in new person.
Yeah.
What does that mean? We know that the land issue things are still so contentious.
Sure.
We've even formed a land commission.
Sure.
We heard the chairman go to the National Assembly saying that there was no support, there was no infrastructure, they couldn't do anything.
Sure.
We really haven't seen anything.
Sure.
But few rumors about land being sold illegally or being given to government and their spouses, government officials and their spouses, and all sorts of rumors.
Sure.
But our president knows his reasons why he's moved him from lands. I feel that if he had been doing a good job, possibly he wouldn't have been moved.
Sure, we might have to end there because we might not get to the other stories otherwise. But I think
there's so much to talk about in this area.
I was going to say, I think the viewers must appreciate that this is probably the biggest story of the week, and so we would spend more time on it really than any other story. I think that's only to be expected, but thank you for that, Mr. Mberge, and maybe we need a whole program just to discuss the cabinet reshuffle. Well, thank you for that. And now on to our next story. Again, something that's in the lap of the government. The TRRC issued its report last year, and civil society organizations have had their say from the get-go. As soon as the report came out, they had something to say. Now they've done their own kind of shadow white paper where they've come up with recommendations for the government about what they should do about the TRRC's recommendations. Have a look.
It is important that these issues are communicated to victims and the Gambian population as whole, because it's important that people don't feel that we are just ignoring the situation or perpetrators are not prosecuted. As Sira says, there is a pattern, there is a route that we have to follow.
In its work, the CSO working group consulted communities and victims across the Gambia to produce the shadow white paper. They now hope that the Office of the Attorney General and Ministry of Justice will implement their recommendations.
Now, in reference to the last story, Mr. Mberge, I said, we could have a whole show devoted to it. I think to this one as well, there could be a whole show devoted. We heard their shadow white paper with their own recommendations, and they're kind of trying to hold government's feet to the fire. because it's what, in June, that government has to come forward and say, this is what we're going to do. What's the sense you get about what might happen?
Oh, this is going to be an extremely difficult one. I think that when it comes to what we call those who bear the most responsibility, for what happened, the atrocities, really, there's no excuse. There's no discussion. There shouldn't be any discussion. They should be prosecuted. But we will have certain areas where we're going to have amnesty. So this is it. Prosecutions, amnesties, and the reparations.
Well, that's right.
It will go on a long time. What's going to happen? Who are we going to give amnesty to?
Yes.
And why? Who wouldn't we give amnesty to?
Well, that's right. And that came through in the press conference, if people had watched the full report on the news. Because they did say that, yes, there are certain people, you know, crimes against humanity do not give you any kind of amnesty. But what I always found interesting of the whole TRRC from the get-go was that all the previous Truth and Reconciliation Commissions in other countries, when they finished and they wrote their report, there was an element of reparations in it. This one had it from the beginning. Those others did not. It's actually even in the name. And so that's going to be quite a difficult thing. How do you give? And some of them have, let's be honest, some of the victims have said, we're not talking about financial reparations. We want it to be in another form, either an honest admission and request for an apology to us, etc., etc. So that's going to be quite complex. But you touched on the thing there about amnesties. Because some people, as we know, were both perpetrators and victims. And so, and also they came forward and they spoke, they gave testimony. And so if anyone took the time to go through, they would see that the report actually sets out some of the conditions under which people are entitled to an amnesty. I mean, again, as you said, it's a difficult one to gauge, but what sense, again, do you get in terms of the public mood and also the mood from the CSOs, who've been quite vocal?
Yes, I mean, if the CSOs, if they had their way, but would implement everything.
Which is kind of what they said.
Actually,
what they said in the shadow white paper.
That's it. And with the reparations bit as well, I think because of the precedents, we learned from that.
Yes.
And integrated it in the...
That's right.
That's the benefit of, I suppose, of being among the last, really, to do these things. You learn from others. And of course, that is always going to be tricky, not least because of, let's be honest, a huge chunk of it would be about funding the money.
Exactly.
That's it. Yes. Where would it come from?
Where it's going to come from?
That's it, that sort of thing. And yes, with the amnesties. You see, because we want the bigger fish, so you may find yourself sort of giving amnesty to the smaller one, so that in the prosecutions there could be witnesses.
Well, that's
so
right.
these compromises. So we have to build it into our expectations.
Sure.
You know what I mean? Given this is the reality, so let's be worldly and let us be mature about it. Much of what the government is going to decide, you're always going to have a faction of people who will say no, who will disagree.
Well, inevitably.
Yes. So you will never have anything where everybody says right. I mean, yeah, obviously, Jammeh being prosecuted, and even then some might say no.
Yeah, quite.
So let us be ready for that.
Exactly.
Whatever they do, some would go with it, others wouldn't.
And not long to wait. So just less than a month away. Thank you for that, Mr. Mboj. And now on to a completely different story. Across Africa, you hear people talking about corruption scandals and things. And this one we have to tread carefully because the case is in court. And so in our discussion, obviously we don't want to prejudice the case, but it's been one that has been much talked about. If you're wondering what I'm talking about the Gam Petroleum Scandal. Have a watch.
The alleged offences occurred between January and October 2021, and the state charges say they thereby caused economic loss to the government and others. Sehu Drameh, as general manager, is accused of stealing over $235,000 paid by Gaj Global for the supply of petroleum product, the property of international traders in trust of Gambia Petroleum Storage Facility Limited. The charges accuse general manager Sehu Drameh and operations manager Lamin Gassama of fraudulently appropriating gas oil 5,919.6 metric tons, valued at $4.7 million, and gasoline 721.9 metric tons valued at $692,000, the property of Adax Energy, an international oil trader. The two are also accused of having fraudulently released petroleum product of Adax Energy without authority, resulting in the Gambia Petroleum Storage Facility and the Ministry of Finance and Economic Affairs paying the international trader approximately $5.4 million as trustees settlement, causing economic loss to the government of the Gambia.
You heard our colleague there causing economic loss to the government of the Gambia, and I think that has been at the crux of why this case has been brought. Government has been stung, and because these agreements have been signed, and to honor them, they had to pay up for something they didn't do, and for something they didn't get. I was trying to work out how many trillion $21 million is, but my calculator ran out of zeros, Mr. Mboch. And as I said, we have to be careful because the case is in court and it's back in court on Monday. But again, quite a staggering thing. And if one reads the 30-page charge sheet, quite a sophisticated operation, it is alleged. Your thoughts on that?
That's it. And I was wondering, how did it get to this? Didn't we have the periodic? One would have thought that you would have a properly working monitoring mechanism.
Well, that's the thing that occurred to me. Yes. I mean, because two people have been accused, and could something of this magnitude boil down to just two people, whereby if you had a checks and balances system worthy of the name, it should not have gotten to that stage. Yeah.
Yes, and you realize that, remember the report, the task force that was formed by the president to look into why we had a fuel shortage at that period, was it 2021, October, November, something like that. And then when they came back, see Decatur, now the Minister of Finance, formerly of Trade, is still overseeing trade. What was it in the report? Fraud. Massive procedural errors, recklessness, and lack of transparency at the Gam Petroleum Field Depot.
This is it. And that is what it exposed. And I have to say, I think we briefly discussed it when it was mentioned that there was going to be a task force, and we certainly mentioned it on the news. But I have to say, in the office, we were quite cynical. We were like, yeah, you know, they're saying this just to kind of pacify the public. Nothing will come of it. But, and that's one of the reasons why I chose it, something has come of it, and something quite big. And, I mean, were you surprised? I was, I have to be honest.
I'm not sure whether I was surprised, because remember that for a while now, whatever happens in these institutions, the president will form a commission of inquiry.
Sure.
We've had a few, be it Social Security, what happened at Faraba, and the rest of it. We've been seeing it, even in the Casamance, there's a task force. So I wasn't surprised there. But this is it. I mean, we've seen how many reports saying that it appears as if our government is not doing much to tackle corruption. We've seen it in so many different reports.
Sure.
So we hope that this would be the beginning of something. We do not know what the outcome would be. But again, for people to face the prospects of being prosecuted.
Sure. That's right.
You know what I mean? That we mean it. Sort of one gets the sense that perhaps with this formation of the new cabinet, there is a sense that things were not going as well as I wanted to, hence he chopped half.
Well that's right, because so he could have just kept everybody in situ and carried on.
Yes, so we'll see what happens, but this is it. So we'll see what would be the outcome of this case.
This is it, and as I said there, you know, we can't say much about it because we don't want to prejudge, but we'll be watching it with an eagle eye. To see where this one ends. But at the moment, staggering figures that are being bandied about in court. Thank you for that, Mr. Mboch. Again, something entirely different. A Gambian who lives in Germany and is founder of an organization called WIPSO. He's been doing a fantastic amount of work here in the Gambia, and we felt we should highlight the work that he's doing. And when we did so, we actually found him to be quite an interesting character. Have a look.
Even before losing his sight, Omar was involved in humanitarian work, cooking for Muslims to break their fast at various mosques and conference centers across Germany. He tells me that his current condition motivates him even more to continue supporting the less privileged.
It was also my plan even to come to Gambia and to go to the hospital to do this work for our patients. Because we have a lot of patients who may die because of the food that they eat. Not that it's the food that makes them die, but we are eating foods that are not good for our sickness that we are having. For example, we said ulcer, liver problems, lungs problems. There are certain food that they are not allowed to eat.
His Whipsaw Foundation has since its establishment become the leading aid provider for many in Sukuta and beyond. Amongst its recent interventions is the construction of a library at the Sukuta Mosque for English and Arabic students.
There we had Omar Pia Bojang. Mr. Mboj, as I said, quite an inspiring and inspirational figure, which is kind of why we chose to do the story about him. What was interesting, of course, bit that people didn't see and hear there was that he'd been fine. He'd had dreams of becoming a professional footballer and actually qualified as a chef. But what was interesting was people who I know who contacted me after the story was broadcast said that what they found inspiring was that in spite of him going blind, the humanitarian work that he was doing before, he carried on. In fact, he accelerated, actually. And they said that they mentioned this because they thought that we are a society where somebody's blindness inevitably limits what they can or are allowed to do in our society. Is that what you found?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the spirit, when I was watching this story, in the news, I said, wow, what a remarkable spirit this person has. Here really when we talk about appointing people to positions, maybe we'll think about your education, your experience. I think there's a third element that we tend to forget, your character.
Sure.
Yes. Extraordinary adaptation. Remember when he started out, with the dream of becoming a footballer, and apparently, he was contemporaries of Jatu Sina. They used to play together, and there were Star Jane and others. And then 2017, suddenly had an illness, went into a coma, came out blind.
Quite a month. He was in a coma for a month.
Yes.
Came back, and that was it. And he was blind.
But you see, he didn't feel sorry for himself. He accepted his new reality and just moved on with an extraordinary thing to do. You're going to have this indomitable spirit, this will, as it were, this unfetterable will to move on. And look at now what he's trying to do for others.
This is it. It's amazing.
It's
and as I said,
story.
No apologies for choosing this story because
story.
Found it such an inspirational one, and I think you've kind of pretty much summed it up. Thank you for that, Mr. Mboj. And now on to our fifth story, which takes us to the kind of halfway stage. In some parts of the North Bank region, farmers have been complaining about salinity, salt, that's affecting part of where they used to plant their crop. Have a look.
We share these rice fields with Jajari, India, Ilyasa, Jimansara, Alkalikunda and Kachang. We have been complaining for a long time because our income is drastically reduced. During our childhood, there was no salt at this place. It was a thick bush full of trees. The salt intrusion started in 1972 when the Senegalese erected ridges between our fields and theirs. The water stopped flowing and the salt started accumulating. Now, the salt water is destroying our rice. If we have big ridges so that salt water will not flow over, that will help us during the rainy and the dry season.
Now, Mr. Mboj, this is the perfect example of you set out to do a story, a human interest story, and then something happens and flips the script on you. When we went with the intention of doing this story, we had assumed that this was going to be a story about climate change and the effect of climate change and how it was impacting on these farms. And then we found out from what they told us that, as they said, there used to be very thick, bushy area, but when the Senegalese put this ridge, it then started redirecting the salt water, and then, of course, the intrusion has now destroyed what used to be a bush, as well as where they farm. So not quite the story we were thinking.
And very interesting, and he even gave us a date as far back as 1972. Then I thought, whoa, how did that happen?
But this is it. It seems to have been by stealth, because I think, the more if people watch the full story, that the more it happened, the more they thought that, oh, this is just a passing thing, things will change and so on and so on. But it just got worse, and nobody's intervened on their behalf, not government, not anybody. And so they're left with the consequence. They cannot farm where they used to farm.
That's it. And actually, when I was looking at the literature about salt intrusion and the like, yes, you have a good number of reports telling you that it's because of climate change is doing something.
Yeah.
Because apparently, in the past, the rainy season used to sort of provide enough precipitation for the river to push back. That's
exactly.
it. But now it cannot do that. This is the key. But whatever might have been the cause of this, now what do you do?
What do you do about it? What do you do about it? And interestingly, they came up with some suggestions.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Kind of building their own ridges to kind of redirect the salt water away from the land where it is. So I hope the sort of relevant authorities, the authorities are watching and can go there and pay. And that's kind of one of the reasons why we did the story, because we want to bring it to light and say to people, because the other thing is we thought this might be happening in other places that we haven't even featured, that we're not even aware of. And so, no apologies again. We featured it because we thought if we highlight this, perhaps others might come and say, hey, hang on a minute, it's happening to us as well. So yeah.
That's absolutely it. And when you look around, you have engineers in other countries trying to come up with ingenious ways to sort of maybe divert the water, create gullies. But they're coming up with all sorts of ways to deal with the situation. But really, salt intrusion, it's been written about here for a very long time.
Indeed.
So maybe it's time we take it seriously and see what we can do about it.
Yes, and thanks for that. And we hope that we can rescue these farmers and their farmland. Thank you for that, Mr. Mboj. And that takes us nicely onto a commercial break. Join us after the break for 5 more stories. Don't go away.
Looking for the fastest and easiest way to receive money transfers from abroad? Well, Q-Money and RIA just made it happen. Now you can receive international money transfer from RIA directly into your Q-Money account with no additional cost. Once you receive an
Welcome back after that break. And if you're just joining us, welcome. You are watching QTV and you are watching The Week in Review. I'm Adi Darami and I have my co-host Mr. Mboj, and we've been going through 5 stories. We've had 5 really good stories and 5 cracking ones to come. So thanks for joining us. Now, of course, this is Gambia and we don't have COVID-19, do we? Nonetheless, the Ministry of Health think that we should still have a new vaccination campaign. What's this one all about? Have a watch, have a listen.
It is part of the ministry's efforts to meet the WHO target of vaccinating at least 60% of the population. In December 2021, when the target had been set at 40% vaccination, by the end of that year, only 7 African countries had achieved more than 40%. Njai urges those yet to be vaccinated to make use of this opportunity.
Appeal to the general public that the vaccination teams will be moving as a team. Some of them will be doing the sensitization to inform people about the arrival of the vaccination teams in their communities. So some of them also will be moving ahead of the teams to also make certain logistic arrangements prior to the arrival of the vaccination team in certain communities.
Now, Mr. Mboj, again, I chose this one for a very good reason. We heard certain stark statistics. WHO had set a target for 2021 by end of December 2021. 40% should have had their population vaccinated. In Africa, Seychelles were topped with 70%, and there were 6 others. Nobody else came close. I think the nearest under the 40% was 29%. Now, having said that, they then set a target of 60% for this year. If we struggled to get 40% vaccinated, Mr. Mboj, what is the likelihood of getting 60% of the population vaccinated this year in a country where many people don't think the damn thing even exists?
I have to say this. The rate at which we are going, somebody calculated it. I say, at this rate, how long would it take you for you to achieve 60% vaccination? Was it 2196? Something.
That's the reality. Yes.
No, it's not going to happen. And you can see there that we're doing more of the same. You know, during the first, second rounds of vaccinations, they were going around, open up. There was a lot of talk.
That's right.
I'm trying to raise awareness, for people to go and get themselves vaccinated.
Sure.
But we've seen that it was quite poor.
It was poor.
Quite
I mean, there was a kind of spurt in certain areas, and then they kind of ebbed away. And then we had stories that we featured where we had to throw away some vaccines because they went past their expiry date.
That's it. So we go back why? Of course, the disinformation, misinformation,
Sure.
and the skepticism, people do not believe it. But then, what do I do about that? This is why public policy is really very, very difficult. You got to take the reality as it is, but yet you're going to try to find solutions to it. They're just going back out there. You will send people out there, but yet if you haven't taken care of the mentality, nobody would come.
I mean,
you're repeating the same message.
It is essentially the same message. I mean, I remember when it was at its height and people were, for a moment, scared. Somebody opened a new restaurant around Coastal Road, about 150 meters from where I live. So I was taken there by my friend Abdu, and we got there, 20 people or so. I was the only one wearing a mask at a time when they said everybody should wear a mask. And the woman whose establishment it was that was opening that day said, "Don't you think you're being a bit rude wearing a mask when none of us are?" And I said, "Well, I'm protecting me and I'm protecting you because you don't know if I have it. I don't know if you have it." And apart from that, the health minister said we should all here be, if we're in any kind of gathering, we should all be wearing masks. And yet that was the kind of mentality, and I think that still exists.
That's the right thing turned on its head. It's an interesting moral inversion. you're being rude. Yes, this is unbelievable. Perhaps what has changed here, this one is about the age.
Yes,
before
age.
It was 18
well,
and
that's
wasn't
right.
it now? Before 12-year-olds could
yep.
go from 12 and see.
That's right.
But I'm not hopeful. I have
No.
to be honest. From what we've seen, and I haven't seen any change of strategy. More of the same will just give you more of the same.
Yes, I mean, and again, before we came on, I went online, and there are lots and lots of articles saying that apart from a few hotspots, particularly South Africa and other parts of Southern Africa, the kind of death rate that was expected from COVID-19 across Africa simply has not happened. And they're perplexed as to why that is, because it's not because we were brilliant at vaccinations or anything else. Even the strategy of masking up wasn't particularly enforced in most of the countries, and people are completely perplexed. And so a lot of people in Africa were saying, well, we never had it anyway. And so really this is what we're up against, and honestly, they've got a tough job on their hands.
Yes, especially right now.
Yeah.
We hardly talk about it.
It's kind of, it gets mentioned
absolutely.
every now and
so
then.
what chance of getting people coming out in numbers to come and get vaccinated?
A tough one.
That's it. It's a very, very tough one.
Very tough one. And as I said, I wish them luck. Now, on to something else. This is something very close to my heart because I kind of worked on the British version of it, which was digital rights regarding personal data. It's something that people are still getting their heads around in this country, in the Gambia. Have a look, have a listen, and see what you think of this.
Data harvesting happening in the country. If you go to banks, sometimes they ask you certain questions. You go to the doctors, they ask you certain questions. You're like, is this even relevant to like what I'm doing? So this thing is happening here. We've seen the biometric identification process, our passport systems, even the voter registration. They collect a lot of...
Just a snippet there. Mr. Mboji, as I said, I worked on this back in the UK as part of my job, advising ministries and so on rights, digital rights. We're still getting used to the concept here because in Britain particularly, a lot of things are transacted digitally. But I'll mention this only to give an example of when it was being introduced there, ministers and the government had assumed that you'd have a central database where if somebody gave their personal information, that information can then be tapped into by any government department. And then they had awkward people like me come along and said, well, actually, if you bother to read the law, it says if Ade gives his personal information for one particular service, it can only be used for that particular service. Even if you say you're going to take it and use it for my own good, the law does not allow you. I have to give my personal data again to that other service and another, even if I have to give it 100 times. That is what I don't think is being grasped here.
Absolutely, yes. That comes from respect of people's privacy.
Indeed.
That which is hugely important. But this is the difference, isn't it? There you have a more sophisticated bureaucracy.
Yeah, quite.
And then the laws, how they'll be discussed in the parliaments and the courts. So that sort of thing. So over here, how many rights have we had? But we simply haven't got the infrastructure, as it were, to fulfill, as it were, for us to carry out our responsibilities, and responsibilities. So this is really the key. But again, it's a good thing that we are thinking about it, we are discussing it.
Yes, because the world is moving on, and for some of us, we might have to go and transact or deal with the world outside of the Gambia, and so we need to get used to the idea that this is what obtains outside of the Gambia, so we may as well get used to doing it here.
And absolutely, and even for our own sake.
Of course.
Given the transitional, period, as it were. Yes. So certain good habits could be built in.
Sure.
Into that transformation.
That's right.
Of course, in the beginning, it will be shoddily implemented. We all know that we will struggle.
Sure.
Obviously. But I like the fact that we've thrown in these ideas into the debate, into the body politic. You never know what it might do in the future.
Thank you for that. And just to say, this is addressed to government. If you are going to implement this, these are some of the things you need. Every government ministry, every government department has to have a data controller. You have to have somebody who actually transacts with the public and tells them how their data is going to be used. If a member of the public writes to you, within 7 days you have to tell them. They will say to you, I want every instance where you have used my personal data or you've mentioned me. It's in an email, whatever. You have to give it to me and you have to give it to them. That's just a few. There are like 100 other things. So trust me, this is a big one. Stonebridge, I'll leave that thought for them. Something else which again obtains in parts of the world, a national health insurance scheme. In America, they had this kind of Obamacare, which President Trump had said he would remove on day one in office. As far as I'm aware, he was kicked out of office and he never got around to removing it. The Gambia is about to adopt its own national health insurance scheme. Have a look, have a listen.
The board comprises a chairperson, the permanent secretaries of the Health and Finance Ministries, the Director of Health Services, the Managing Director of the Social Security and Housing Finance Corporation, the Chief Executive Officer of the National Health Insurance Authority, a representative of the Health Professional Councils, and the Commissioner of Insurance.
There you heard our colleague Choi. What you're talking about is the board that's actually going to oversee and implement this. And on the face of it, actually, it seems really a good thing. What's your thoughts on it? Because you're aware of the system that obtains in England and in America and so on, and that's long established now, almost 100 years. But now this is new for us. Your thoughts on that?
That's it. For me, even when they were debating the bill, the health insurance scheme, the bill 2021, which was passed. Yes. So some of us were, of course, thinking about how feasible, where are we going to get the funding? Logistically, how are we going to roll it out? What would be the mechanisms out there and all the rest of it? So we need more details, don't we, about this whole thing. How does it work? For instance, last night I was talking to somebody who said to me, with this new insurance scheme, health insurance scheme, does it mean that I can just go to any pharmacy and buy anything? I had to tell him, maybe there might be selected pharmacists. I'm not sure whether because we do not know the details and that sort of thing.
Yes.
But of course, in theory, a brilliant idea. A lot of people suffer.
Well, this is true. And just so people know, the way it kind of progressed in England, which probably kind of set the template that other countries then kind of mimicked. In England, when I first went in 1970, and people don't believe this when you tell them, but if you went to either a doctor, your general practitioner, the GP, the local doctor, or to the hospital, if you were given a prescription, you took it to the pharmacy, and it was free. And that obtained for many years. You got a free prescription for whatever. Then they announced that it was going to be 20p as free. There was uproar. And then it went up to 50p. And then £1. And then, God knows, it's probably 10 quid now. But suddenly people had to pay for prescriptions. And so the whole thing changed. And how it works, of course, there is that when you get paid, your employer deducts a certain amount which is called your NI, national insurance, and it goes into this. And so theoretically, that is what funds it. But government also adds to that to actually help it go, to keep it going. And I guess what you're alluding to is that how's government going to find this extra bit to add to it so that people get it at, you know, the point of request. That, you know, I want to be treated for this, that, or the other. You get it, and you know, you get your prescription. Prescriptions are still heavily subsidized, even though they go. And then, if you're over a certain age, 60, prescriptions are free.
Yes, I was just talking to somebody, the same person last night, about the NI idea, national insurance contributions.
Yeah.
So the funding is going to come from somewhere. I think there was a group of researchers who actually did research on this, asking how best to fund this.
Right.
It was surprising, a huge number said taxation. I said, oh, be careful with that. Because when you do that, you might lose somewhere else. You can't tax your people too much for certain things. So this will be quite interesting. And also when you look at structurally, a lot of activity happens outside of formal framework.
Of course.
You know, that sort of thing. And you know, in Britain it's easier because of the structures there.
The society,
the society,
whether they like it or not, is quite regimented.
It's regimented.
Ours is less so.
Yeah, that's it. But ours is less so. So it will be interesting to see how they can be innovative. This is where we talk about innovation all the time.
Let's tailor it to our own situation. Let's not try and mimic something that obtains somewhere else when society and conditions are different.
The soil. When the soil is different, then what I can grow there might be, you know, restricted. It's in the logic of the soil.
Right. So don't try and grow palm trees where you can only grow grapes. But
wasn't it Museveni? I remember when he was quite popular with the West. He said, "Hey, look, a plant that grows in cold countries, you really cannot bring it to a hot country and expect it to grow."
This is it, and I think that's the analogy that the board should take. But genuinely, I mean, to be serious for a moment, I think we wish them well, because it's a fantastic scheme.
Brilliant idea.
And it's a brilliant idea, and we certainly hope that it works.
We say it all the time. Health and education, the population will fly.
Absolutely true. Thank you for that. Now on to our penultimate story. Again, one that's close to my heart, certainly. It was, I have to be honest, I know there's World Heritage Day. I didn't know there was an African World Heritage Day. But yes, there is such a beast. Have a look.
The percentage of Africa represented in the World UNESCO list is about 12%. Right, and then this is a very small percent in the list of World Heritage. And then, if you look at also in the listing of these heritage sites, most of the African heritage are also endangered. You know, and then, you know, because of that's why they want to create more awareness to Africans to be able to protect and also preserve, you know, conserve the heritage.
Now, these sites, we're not just preserving and conserving them just for the sake of it. There's logic behind it. Because in the countries where they've been conserved and preserved, people go and visit these sites as tourist attractions, and they pull in billions of dollars annually. Now, what people may or may not have heard in that report is that in Africa, the amount of sites that are on the World Heritage Sites list is 12%. That's not even funny. Now, I take this personally because myself and others had been trying to get a particular site, Bunce Island, an island off the coast of Sierra Leone that had been used as a slave port, as a slave trading post. And then after the abolition, slaves were sort of temporarily settled there before being taken to Freetown. The nearest we got at the time was to get it onto a provisional list. And I'm telling you this 25 years on from us trying to get it. Now, in the European countries and the Americas, they're a lot more savvy about how they lobby their governments, get behind it. They throw their weight behind it. They throw consultants behind it. And they pay big money to people to actually pester UNESCO until they get on this list. Sorry to say, that's what happens. But Stonebridge, we don't have those resources to do that kind of thing. We're just hoping against hope.
Yes, I'm here. I was reading that we've got only 2 World Heritage Sites,
yes.
the Kunta Kinte Island
and the Senegambia Stone Circle.
The Senegambia Stone Circles.
Yeah, yeah.
Of course, Ade, we've turned this into a kind of commodity, and they always take
talk
the
about
largest,
heritage tourism.
always the largest share and the sort of thing. I mean, Ade, I think by now you know my views.
Yeah,
I'm a skeptic of this whole thing about heritage culture. I don't know. It seems to me that it tends to turn culture as a kind of decoration. The ideas, the energy, the spirit that really created those things, they're very alien to us. We don't even know it. It has not infused me as a character, as a human being.
Yeah, right.
So it is just, I don't know, it's just something brought on by sort of cheap travel.
But that's right. No, I know, because there's an element of that. I mean, and if you take, for example, the stone churches at Lalibela in Ethiopia, they're the oldest churches in the world. They get hundreds of thousands of visitors a year. Not far from where we are now, in Cape Verde, Cidade Velha, which just means old city, is the oldest European-built settlement in the tropics, anywhere in the tropics. It was the first. And because of that historical oddity that it is, Cidade Velha, of course, is on the list, and it gets tens of thousands of visitors because even though it was in the tropics, the Europeans obviously built it with a kind of European mentality. So, you know, the streets are built in a certain way and so on, as they would have been built in Portugal. And so there is an element of preserving history, things that belong to the kind of the history of the country or the continent and so on. I mean, you know, again, in Ethiopia, of course, now people point out to Europeans who say, we introduced Christianity to Africa. The Ethiopians can say, actually, no, you didn't. In fact, because if you did, the oldest churches in the world would not be in Ethiopia, they'd be somewhere in Europe. And so there's an element of that as well, that, you know, we've tended to kind of, because as you said, it comes down to numbers. But that other 88%, which is in Europe and in South America, they've very cleverly used it for the very reasons. You say cheap travel. It makes them billions a year.
Absolutely.
And we're missing out.
You will never deny that. One will never deny. There's a lot of money in it. But when I'm preserving, I must ask my question, why do I want to preserve this?
Yes,
what is the motivation for the preservation?
Of course.
For instance, let's take the royal family in Britain. I once had a discussion with somebody. The person's, the rationale, the whole justification for having that, the person restricted it to because the tourism, it brings in so much money. I said, actually, that was in the private motivation for its establishment.
At all not.
So that meaning,
sure,
you see, this whole tourism bit, this is very modern. This just came, you know, a few centuries, few decades.
Easy travel.
With easy travel. So obviously milk that money, whatever comes in, as much as possible.
Sure.
But there is a basic meaning to this heritage. What does it mean to us? So it's like it's just for the tourists, huh? What does it mean for us? It's just like decoration.
It has to mean something.
It has to mean something.
I think I'd agree with you on that. Thank you for that. And that takes us on to our final story. Over the last weekend, of course, everybody was celebrating Eid around the world. and for a change, including football teams and their fans. Have a look. It is a sign of changing times. Usually, football clubs hardly acknowledge their Muslim supporters. However, that is changing, as more and more football players and their fans wear their Muslim faith with pride. Recently, in some of the biggest leagues, including the English Premier League, referees have allowed Muslim players to take a break during a match to break their fast when it has coincided with the time to break the fast. The English Premier League, which has many players who are Muslims, allowed for the first time last season, and the trend has continued this year. Also, this year joining the festivities, World Football Governing Body FIFA leads the way with the tweet, Eid Mubarak to our followers around the world. And they are joined by several big football clubs, including European giants Manchester United, with a tweet stating, best wishes to all those who are celebrating Eid. Manchester United, Liverpool, Manchester City, Mr. Mboj, all these big clubs, Barcelona, Real Madrid, Paris Saint-Germain, all of them. Of course, now they all use social media a lot. And of course, a lot of them have Muslim players and Muslim fans, but they'd never acknowledge them. In fact, I tried to go back, and a couple of them did it last year. They sent Eid Mubarak, but not all of them. This year, almost all of them have done that. Changing times.
We are of an age where we remember the time when how they used to look at some of these Muslim players. They seem so awkward. You know, oh, why do you have to fast? Stuff like that.
Right.
But of course, in numbers,
yeah.
Now they have formed the force. So you have to acknowledge that.
That's right.
And the players themselves have insisted on it.
This is it.
So you have to acknowledge it.
And you know, they've forced managers and coaches to say, like Fofana, we saw Wesley Fofana there last year. He was the first one, and of course the picture went viral. They stopped the match. The referee actually stopped the match for him to go to the side, take a banana. Because theoretically, you're not allowed to leave the pitch without the permission of a referee, of course. And allowed him to take a banana and a drink to break his fast during a game. And that was like, wow, this has happened. And that's something that 10 years ago would have seemed unthinkable.
Isn't that the nature of the game?
Yeah, correct.
We remember when, some people, you've read somewhere, when the first time they introduced yellow cards.
Or substitutes.
Substitutes.
1966 World Cup. Somebody had to be injured before, you know, and even when you were injured, you couldn't. I mean, Pele in the game against Portugal in 1966, they kicked him till he could barely walk. He could not leave the pitch because substitutes were not allowed. And people were thinking, why don't they substitute him? No, people who are watching it now thinking, why don't they take him off? Well, substitutes were not allowed.
In 1970, they introduced the cards.
That's right. Exactly.
So this is it.
The game changes.
Nothing really comes fully formed.
Sure.
It's constantly growing.
Sure.
So we've reached to a point where they have to be mature about things. Indeed, they have to respect things in this age.
Sure.
So they've got this. What next?
We wait and see. Thank you for that. And that brings us nicely to the end of the program. So thank you, Mr. Mboj, for your interjections and interventions so far. And the heritage one, I think we'll have to set aside a whole program to debate that one. But to our viewers, as ever, I say thank you for watching. And until the next time, it's goodbye.